Hey, and welcome to another video. In this video, we're going to do Azure Storage and React Native again, but this time we're going to be rendering PDFs, and it's going to look like this. Now, the clients also asked us to do it as an iPad application, so we're going to need to do it on our MacBook. And then the other thing that they've also asked is, can we go through service principal authentication? Now, service principal authentication is more like what you would be asked to be implemented as if you're asked by an enterprise company or any company who's proficient at using Azure and Azure Identity. So with that, let's get started and let's get coding. Okay, so first, as always, I'm going to need you to have completed the checklist that you can see on the screen here. I've also put it in the description below. So once you've done that, then let's get started. So the first challenge is let's set up the access to Azure Storage. Alright, so here we are inside the Azure portal. Let's take a look at the storage account that we've previously set up, and we've placed the invoices already inside from the customer. So opening that up, we're going to go to the storage account, and then we're going to go to the container that we've set up, which we've actually called invoices. Inside there, you'll see the two PDFs that have been provided by the customer, ready to go and be rendered on the iPad. Now, the question is, how do we give access? And we were requested to do that with a service principal. A service principal is an identity for a registered application in the directory. For registered applications, we need to go to our app registrations. So to create a new application, we're just going to go app registrations in the search bar. When app registrations comes up, we're just going to click that, and then we're going to go ahead and create a new one. Now for this, we're going to call it Grocery Mate. That's going to be the name of our iPad application. We're going to skip past the redirect URI because we're building a native iPad app, we're not building a website. Simply hit create, and then you'll see that it's as simple as that, it's all created. Now the next thing I want you to see on screen is you will see that object ID, or that client ID, sometimes known as. That's going to be useful later, but we will come back to it. Now closing that, let's give it access to the storage. So going to the back to the storage account. Now instead of doing it at the container level, we're actually going to do it at the account level. So let's do that access. Let's do the role assignment. We're adding a new one in. Now we do the minimal level possible. So we're going to do storage blob data reader. This is going to entitle it only to reading access, no delete or modifying, because it doesn't need that. So once that's done, search for Grocery Mate, and all we do is hit the OK button and then save it there, and then that'll be saved and added as soon as we get the green tick on the right hand side. There we go. So with that, that's saved. Let's switch across to Visual Studio Code. So once again, we're inside Visual Studio Code. This difference is I'm on my MacBook. Now, the first thing I want you to do is make sure you've got your packages installed. So you should have React Native Vue PDF, Axios, fast-xml-parser, and buffer. The next part is make sure you've done your pod install to make sure all the packages are linked up correctly. After that, we're going to make sure we've imported PDF Vue from that React Native Vue PDF. We're also going to have imported Blob client from a Blob storage file sitting on the left-hand side here in the services, and we're going to fill that out later in the video. Now for this specific file, the app.js, we're going to make two components. One is going to be a show PDF component, and its responsibility is to render the PDF to the user that they've selected. The other one is the list PDF component. That's going to render a selectable list of all the PDFs ready for the user to select them. So with that, let's switch across to Simulator. Now the simulator, you can see I've got my iPad, which is what the client requested. The other thing you can see is that I've got a header which says invoices. Now on the left hand side, we're going to put that list invoices component, and then on the right hand side, we're going to put the show PDF component, which is going to take up the whole remaining space. With that, let's get coding and let's start doing it. Now the first one we're going to do is the list invoices component. Let's first look at some of the parameters that we've got. So the first parameter, we've got a width, we've then got invoices, we've then got set selected. Set selected is going to be important for when the user clicks a button for it to show. Now, next, first thing we're going to do, let's just check the invoices to make sure if it's null, because if it's null, we're going to return back loading. Now, if it's not null, we can then safely proceed. So safely proceeding, we're actually going to return back a view. And with that view, we're going to need to style it and give it some width, and that's going to be based on the width that's passed in. The next part is we're going to bring in a flat list. That flat list is going to take the invoices, and it's going to render out that selectable list on the left-hand side for the user. So here we give an initial number, the initial number for the length, and that's just invoices.length. And then let's go ahead and let's render out the items. Now, our function for rendering out the items, we're going to return a button, and on that button, we're going to put the item.blob name. So with that item.blob name done, we can then go ahead and we can just close off the button itself. Now next we're going to need the key extractor. The key extractor, we're just going to do index2string. Remember, it's meant to be a unique identifier. In the future, I would advise that you use a GUID of some sort, which is maybe corresponding to the blob object. But with that, we can close that off. And now we can go down and put it into the main view. So to put it in, we're just going to copy the name of the component first. So going and copying that component, we're then going to go and put it inside a view. Now remember, they needed to be sitting side by side. To do that, we're going to use a flex direction of row. That's going to mean they can sit side by side. Now, after doing that, and we've set that to row, we can go ahead and put the PDF, the list PDF in. Now, it's going to need that parameter of invoices. How are we going to supply that invoices? We can do it through state. So yes, we're going to do a const invoices, set invoices, and let's do use state, and let's go null, or actually maybe one better, why don't we put a fake one in there for the moment to actually just test it on screen. So let's put in a new array, and we're going to put blob file, blob name, sorry, and then we're going to put test file 1 as the name of the blob. Now, simply, we're going to go save that, but first we need to put in the width. So we're going to put a nice width of 20% of the screen. So with that saved, let's switch across to the simulator. We can see it right there, and we can see that it's a button because we're able to click it. Now with that done, let's go do the show PDF component. So going up to there, first let's take a look at it. So we pass in a selected, and this is the selected invoice that the user has clicked previously. So first, why don't we actually see whether we've passed in content. Now we're going to be doing it a little bit differently. So we're going to do if PDF 64 content. Now this is actually going to be the space 64 content of the invoice, which we'll come back to in a second. And then if it's not there, we're just going to return back, please select a file from the left-hand side. Now, once we've given that command to the user, we can move on to actually rendering it. Now, to render it, we're going to go ahead and use it as a party inside the state, of course, like before. So that PDF 64 content is going to be stored inside the state. And we're just going to go here and we're going to say use state, but we're just going to make this one null. Now, after we've got that state variable, we can go ahead and use it. So now let's go return, and then let's go PDF view, which is the library that we imported earlier. And then we're going to go ahead in here. We're going to give it a style. Now remember, I had to fill up the rest of the page. And for that, we want to do flex 1. The next part we're going to do is we're going to go and specify the resource. Now that's the resource for it to show the PDF. Now we need to just tell it what type that resource is. It's going to be base 64. And then we're also going to set an on error, where that on error is simply going to tell you that it can't render the PDF and also display the error message. It would be better in the future to use a logging framework instead of doing just a console.log. But that's set for another video. Now with that, that's actually that component ran. Now the one thing I want you to notice here is how do we get from selected to PDF 64 content? And for that, we're going to use a use effect. Now, the reason we do this is because that use effect is going to be ran after the components are actually visualized on the page or rendered. This is important because it allows us to use asynchronous commands inside that use effect. So we could make that asynchronous. But for this, we're going to go if selected does not equal null. And then also we're going to go and basically get the blob base64 from our blob storage using the blob client that I mentioned earlier. And we can see here that after we've got it, we're just going to set that PDF64 content, and as simple as that, the show PDF component is actually done. So let's take that, let's put that in that view we created earlier. And just putting that in, we need to pass in the selected as well. So let's go selected equals selected item. Now, once we've got that selected item, we can just close it off. Let's do that selected item through state as well. So const selected, set selected item, and then for this one, we can actually go use state null. With that done, the next part we are going to do is need to pass that set selected into the list PDF component like we spoke about earlier. So when the user selects it, they can go ahead and do that. So now that we've got that, we'll just change that to be selected instead of selected item. And then also let's go and set the invoices. Let's similarly do it with a use effect. So use effect, and then open it up. And inside that use effect, we're going to go and use our blob client again. So we're going to say if something's been, if selected is not equal null, or actually we don't need to do that because we're not checking the selection itself. So we'll just take that out for the moment. But instead, the way we can do it is we're going to go just blob client.getBlob. We're not going to have a path to go to. Then once we've returned the blobs, we're just going to set the invoices, and then that's going to set it able to be shown inside the iPad application. Now, in order for these use effects to actually run, the other thing I didn't mention was they need to listen to something. So for this one, it doesn't actually need to listen to anything. We're just going to have it run all the time it's rendered. But for the other component, we're going to get it to rerun only when the selected variable or the parameter is being thrown in that has changed. So with that, that's all done. Let's check it in the iPad. So we can see that we've got that loading message for both of them. So now let's go ahead and let's do our blob storage, our blob client that I mentioned earlier. So opening up the blob storage, I've got 3 functions that we need to write. One is an auth. This is responsible for getting the Microsoft auth response token that we're going to use to talk to the blob service, and it's going to contain our service principal. The next is our get blob base64, which is going to return this blob content in that base64 content that the PDF view control needs. And then the last one is our get blobs. Our get blobs is going to return all the blobs at the given path that's been passed in. So let's go ahead and let's code them in now. So starting with the auth, we're going to be speaking out to Microsoft's login endpoint. So for that, we're going to have to set up a query object. We're going to first put a grant type, and we're going to make that be client credentials. That is, we're asking for a response token which represents the client's credentials. The next part is we're going to need the client ID, which we spoke about earlier, but let's leave that blank for now. Then next, we're going to need the client secret, which we'll also leave blank. And then lastly, we're going to need to declare the scope. So the scope we're going to declare is to storage. And on the storage, we're just going to get the default scope. Now, once we've got that, we can then set up our axios request. Now, our axios request is going to do an HTTP request, and we're going to request it to this URL. So let's go ahead and put that in. We are going to have to put that in, and we're going to have to basically parameterize this tenant ID. So let's go ahead and make a const tenant ID. Now, once we've got that const tenant ID, we'll leave that blank, but we'll parameterize that into that string, and then we can go ahead and actually go get all the things. But first, let's actually configure that axios request. So here, we're going to go await axios, and then this axios is going to do that HTTP request I spoke about before. We're going to do a post, we're going to go to the URL, we're actually going to stringify that query object, which is going to put it in the query parameters that's required by the login endpoint. And then we're going to, in the headers, we're going to tell it the application type that's coming through. Now, because we've used that query object into that query string, we're going to be using an application x www form URL encoded, which is code for when we use that query string. Now, after we've done that, we can simply close it off. Now, the reason it's complaining to me is just because I've got an extra closed bracket. If we take that out, now we can return back our response. And then inside of that, there's going to be an access token variable that we can use to basically communicate with our Azure Blob on behalf as the service principal. Now, to get these other variables, let's go across to the portal. Once we're inside the portal, we can actually get them by going up to the top and going to our app registrations and finding that grocery mate application that we made before. Now inside of here, you'll find the tenant ID right here. We'll go ahead and copy that. We'll bring that inside Visual Studio Code and paste that in. The next one that we need is our client ID. We can find that just above it. So copy that and put that in. And then the last one is our client secret. Now a client secret we are going to have to create. So let's go back to it. Let's go to certificates and secrets on the left-hand side. And then after that, we're going to create a new secret. And we're going to give it a description, just call it client. And then you'll see we're hitting an expiry of recommended 6 months. You can change it to whatever you want it to be. We're going to copy that value and put that into the application. Make sure you store that secret somewhere safe as well for the future. Now, once we've done that, that's the auth done. We'll have our response token, so let's go ahead and use it. First, let's do this get blob base64. So first, we're going to go const auth equal the token equals await auth. That's going to bring back that access token. Next, we're going to go and do our response. So we're simply going to go await axios. This one's going to be a get request. Now, when we're doing that get, we're going to go ahead and actually go out to the storage and get the content of it. Now we're doing the get here, and then next we're declaring our response type. We want it to be an array buffer. An array buffer is going to represent the stream of the content, and that stream is then what we can use to convert into that base64. We're going to specify the URL by going blob URL as our prefix, / the blob name that they've put in, or I should say the blob path. Now, the blob path, we're just going to change our parameter to be called that. And then with that, that's basically that done, but we do have to put in the headers. And for the headers, we're going to tell it that we're basically passing in a version. Now this version's important and it's mandated by the storage REST API endpoint for Azure. This is the storage version that I'm referencing. The next part, I'll pass in that authorization, and I'm passing in that access token that we've got from our auth function earlier. Now, after doing that, I can go and say then, and then I'm going to just return back the response, but I'm going to convert that array buffer using the buffer library by just passing in, telling it that it's binary, and then just doing a two string, and in that two string, we can just specify base64. And with that, that's then going to basically make our response have that. So we're going to change it to blob response. And then we're going to go ahead and we're just going to return that blob response back from the function. And that's it. That's the function done. Now let's go on to the next one. So get blobs. So let's take a look at where we're going to get it from. We're going to get it from the REST API. And you can see it right here. So we're going to use the list blobs endpoint. And this is what the request looks like and the get request we need to make. So let's take that. But first, let's use, similar to before, get that auth token. Now, once we've got the token, the next part, let's do our response. Now, for our response, we're going to do axios like you saw on screen just then. We're going to do a get request. And that get request for the URL is going to be what we saw inside that web page. But for that, it's actually just the blob URL that we had above. And then it's question mark, and then that string that we saw before. So pasting that in, we're going to go and make sure that it says res type equals container and that comp equals list. That's going to tell it to list out the blobs that sit inside that storage container. Now, with that done, the next part we're going to do is we're going to provide it with headers. Now, the headers on it for this one, same as before, we need to give it a version. So let's give it that same version. And then like we did before, we're also going to give it an authorization, which is that token that we've got above. Now, remember, you could do this as a variable somewhere in the page, might be better. But with that done now, we can actually go and return back that blobs. Now, we're going to do a const here. Now, before doing it, let's just switch back to the browser and see what the return type is. If we go to the response here, you'll see that it actually comes back as XML format. So we need to handle that. For that, we're going to use that fast-xml-parser that we had installed at the beginning. So going ahead and doing that, we go fast-xml-parser.parse, and then inside the parse, we're going to put that in. So first, we haven't actually done the import for it, so we should actually go and do the import. So let's import actually we'll do the rest as well at the same time. So import QS from QS, and then import fast-xml-parser, the one we want. And then the last one we need to do is actually import buffer as well, which is we just used earlier. Now with those imports done, we can actually continue. So let's go back down. And then inside of here, we go .parse. And then inside the parse, we're going to put that list response. And inside that, we're going to take the data. And then we're going to put enumeration results. And then we're going to go and put blobs.blob. How do I know that? That's because I've had a look at the XML response before and I know how to traverse it, but that's how you've done it. Now next we go x, and then we make a lambda function where we're going to return back the object that we were doing is similar to the test that we did before. So return back the blob name, which is going to be just the name. And then we're going to put when it was created, which we're going to look at the properties of the thing we're enumerating through right now. And then we're going to find creation time. And then we're going to put blob modified as well. And for that, we're going to take the modified time. Now, after we've got the last modified there, that completes the object. And now we can actually set up returning it. So all we're going to do is now go return to the blobs back from the container and bring that through. Now with that, that's all done with the blob storage file. But first we do need to set this blob URL. So let's go up the top and let's declare that. So const blob URL equals, and then to do that, let's just go to the portal first and go grab it. So going to the portal, we go to our storage count, and then after going to the storage count, we know the first part we're going to need is actually the storage count name. So copying that across, we're going to copy that and put that in. Now, after putting that in, the endpoint that we're going to be speaking to is actually the blob endpoint. So that the way we do that, HTTPS at the front, but then .blob.core.windows.net. After we've done that, we need to go to our container. So we're going to go to our invoices, and then that's our blob URL done just like that. Now with our blob URL, let's do a final check, make sure we go through it. It's looking pretty good. We can see our 3 functions are all done. So now we can go across back to our app.js. Now with our app.js, I think actually that's it done. Why don't we check the simulator? So going to the simulator, we can see that we've got on the left-hand side our list. Let's actually click one of them as well. So if we click one of them, we can see that nothing's changing. But don't worry, that's because we haven't put the set selected into the button. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's go and put the on press into the button. And then with the on press, we're just going to call the function that we passed in earlier. So set selected, and then just let's select it as the item there. And then with that, let's re-render it. And then we'll notice now if we click it, voila, there comes the PDF. But it looks a bit small, right? So let's fix that up. So let's go downstairs and let's look at why. It's because this view style, we do need to add a flex 1 to it. The other part, we need to make the container also be flex 1. So once we've done that container flex 1, I think we should be good to go. So let's go back to the container, let's have a look, and there we go. Let's view it full screen. That's what the client's going to receive. So now we can go ahead and we can switch actually on the left-hand side between those two invoices that we've got uploaded. It's being a little bit slow, but there you go. We can see it coming back now, and you'll notice as I click it, I can change back and forth. So with that, we're finally there. We achieved some pretty awesome things then, but they were quite tricky. So I think it's important we recap. The first part to recap on was we used the Azure Storage ATP REST endpoint. Now, why didn't we use the JavaScript client SDK? The reason we didn't use it, after all, React Native is written in JavaScript, so it would be the logical option, was purely because at the time of this project, I found it was better to use the HTTP endpoint for mobile applications. The JavaScript client SDK didn't seem to work. It was much better suited towards my web applications, i.e. my React Web projects. The next part to recap on was we built an iPad application, and for that we needed a MacBook. Now why is that the case? Well, at build time, React Native requires the Apple SDK, and for that you're going to need an Apple device or an Apple iOS image. The last part to recap on was the use of the service principal authentication. Now, why is that so important? Well, it's the backbone of how Microsoft handles its identity for many of its services, including O365 and many other Azure services. This means that your customers are going to be very familiar with it, or you're going to need to know how to work with it if you're building anything against a Microsoft service. Our grocery mate was a service principal for a registered application inside the directory, and it's a good first example of using Azure AD. And I encourage you to go look on it further. So with that, that's the ending of this video. Hit the like button and the subscribe one, but otherwise this is Coder Meets Data. I'm signing out and I'll see you in the next video.